Sustainable You is a casual, interactive, yet informative series detailing and cataloging the sustainability experience. Moreover, this is a short podcast docuseries detailing the thoughts and experiences of passionate advocates towards all things eco-friendly. Our journey is to know how and why understanding sustainable development towards the triple bottom line of people, profit, and planet can contribute to a more mindful, holistic, and inclusive world. Specifically, this podcast showcases what makes you a changemaker, innovator, and transformer as you tackle sustainability challenges for current and future generations to resolve the so-called wicked problems. So for today's recounting of environmental literature and climate action storytelling, I reached out to a UK-based author and researcher of sustainable business practice at the University of Southampton, Dr. Denise Baden. She is showcased on the Forbes list of climate change leaders changing the film and TV industry. Dr. Baden's research aim focuses on how we can utilize mostly fictional narrative motifs to motivate green or eco-friendly behaviors. But we're particularly interested about her published work and eco-themed novels such as Habitat Man, which she'll speak more to later. And of course, the Green Stories Writing Project, which brings together like-minded creative writers to compete in a literary competition. For today's episode, I had an in-depth dialogue on how we can conjure up various climate storytelling tropes towards environmentalism in a positive and effective manner. Do you want to actually introduce yourself, just to give a quick formal introduction, what you do, your background?
Sure.
For our listeners.
Okay, so my name is Denise Baden. I'm Professor of Sustainable Business at the University of Southampton. I founded the Green Stories Project as a way to reach wider audiences and also to try and focus more on solutions. What can we do about issues of climate and biodiversity and sustainability? And that developed into my becoming an author myself. I'd written academic papers and chapters, but I turned then to fiction. So I've written several books, edited anthologies, and that's currently where my joy is. But my day job is still Professor of Sustainable Business at the university, continuing doing teaching and research in that field.
So what makes you uncertain and what makes you curious?
Okay, so when I'm trying, I've taken it upon myself to get a sense in my head of what I would do if I ruled the world, if I had complete power. I feel I need to know the answer to things, and I get really caught up is, should we lean into technology and AI and the market system and make it work for us, or have we gone so far astray, and should we be backing up as fast as we can and taking a different direction? And I'm quite uncertain on that. So I'm always looking around for actual evidence and to engage with people who know more about particular aspects. So that ties into my curiosity as well. It's a jigsaw. When you want to look at trying to make the world a better place, you need to look at everything. You need to look at nature, technology, economics, culture, politics. And so I'm curious about all those things.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing. And tell me about yourself. So your struggles, your aspirations, and your contributions that led towards, participating first in the academic research that you do. So I know your research is based on motivation and behavior behind sustainable practices. And I was just reading up on what you do, and it seems you're involved in a wide variety of projects. So everything from, I know you run your own eco-friendly aesthetic spa, of course, to being a published author of children's environmental literature. So you're doing just a diverse palette of everything in sustainability. Do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Yes, so I got into sustainability as a result of a fiction book. It was a writer, Ben Elton, you may not be familiar, but he wrote this sort of action adventure, but also had little green bits in. And I never would have chosen to watch a climate documentary. It wasn't even an issue back then. But it did sort of spur me to think about the environmental aspects of a lot of my behaviours. And I became interested in that. And my background is psychology, but I ended up almost by accident in the business school. And I was nagging them about recycling bins, so I ended up teaching business ethics and corporate social responsibility and sustainable business. And I got into that field. And the more I got into it, the more I realized the trouble we were in, and that our current business models weren't going to help us, mostly greenwash, to be honest. And so I started really trying to think of what would work and exploring different solutions. And then I became very much worried that we're all talking to ourselves, we're in our own bubbles and sort of green echo chambers. So I started up this sustainable hairdressing project, engaging hairdressers, because washing hair is actually quite a high impact activity, running hot water, very energy intensive. And then as it was fiction that first got me on the road to being a bit of a greenie, I started writing fiction. So I said before, I set up the Green Stories Project, and we've run 20 free competitions now, which has resulted in several publications and a play. And then I started writing myself. And partly what drives me is the need to sort of engage a wider audience. Partly it's to a distraction, I guess, from my own sense of powerlessness. I feel that if I can write stuff, then it can help make it happen. And to a certain extent, it has. So, for example, my first book was Habitat Man, and it was based on this real-life green garden consultant who came round to visit my garden just before lockdown. And he'd retired early because he wanted to help make people's gardens wildlife friendly. And he sorted out a bat box and pollinator friendly plants and put up a water baths and sorted out a pond. And he said, I wanted to do, every garden I can. He said, but I'm just one man. And I thought, well, I can use I can write a book about a man who visits different gardens. And I did, except in my story, he falls in love and he digs up a body. And that was a nice excuse to talk about natural burials, because actually real life burials, the typical ones are quite toxic. They put toxic chemicals in there that literally kill the life in the soil. They use rare hardwood, contributing to deforestation. And anyway, some research was done on it. The English department and in the University of Utah actually did some research. And it showed that readers, 1 month after finishing the book, 98% of them had changed their attitudes, and 60% had adopted at least one green alternative as a result of reading the book. So that was really encouraging, and it spurred me on to do more in that field.
So I knew it was really making a difference. I think sometimes with climate change, you can feel so helpless. So to know that a book that I so enjoyed writing had, other people had really enjoyed reading it. They liked its kind of light, upbeat tone, but they also learnt something. And it's come full circle. So Kevin, who was the inspiration for Habitat Man, said he had an email from someone who read the book, had been thinking about wildlife gardening, but found all the websites too tedious, and then read my book and got inspired, got him along. Now she has a wildlife friendly garden. He's dug a pond and so on. And so it's come all the way round. He's getting customers from the book. I say customers, he doesn't really charge other than sort of a notional fee, because he wants to do it, sort of a post-retirement thing.
Okay, that's interesting to see how you're really involved in doing so much. And personally for me, I got into sustainability through university because I think for me it was when I went to India when I was a kid. The first time I went, I was really surprised there's a lot of poverty here, but the second time it was the amount of pollution. And then when I had come back to Calgary, I had gone to this common reading program thing at the university, and I read this book called No Impact Man. So it's probably similar to your book. I have to read your book as well, but it's about a New Yorker who decides to live a net zero lifestyle for a year. This was back years ago in 2007 when he did that, and he blogged about it, and it inspired me to actually study sustainable development. So it's really interesting, and I agree, I totally agree. Your book probably did inspire others to take on that challenge to become more sustainable, because I did that for the past year in Sweden, and it was not easy.
Also, when you're writing it, you learn a lot yourself, don't you?
That's true. And I still need to blog about what my experience was living in Sweden, because I was just shocked to see how much in North America we're pretty wasteful, and they live very more sustainable lifestyles there, like they're biking all the time, and they don't use like clothing dryers, and it was just shocking to me. So I think that's pretty cool, like that literature can inspire people to change their habits. So
I think it's about culture, isn't it? That's, we're not inherently wasteful. We're actively encouraged to be wasteful, I think, by our system. And I think what we watch on TV and the videos we watch and the movies we watch, and all these can affect how we behave, not just the books we read. I did this project with BAFTA. Are you familiar with BAFTA?
I think
they're kind of like the UK equivalent of the Oscars. They British and Film Television Awards, and they do a lot in this, the film space. And we did a project with them called #ClimateCharacters. And if you sort of check that out on social media, there's probably still some posts there where we contrasted, say, James Bond with his single-use sports car and walk-in wardrobe of luxury suits, with Jack Reacher, who travels by bus and, shops in thrift shops, uses second-hand clothes. So James Bond, has a massive carbon footprint killing the bad guys, whereas Jack Reacher doesn't. And it was just kind of a fun way to highlight, how the impacts, to sort of help us join the dots between our behaviours and the impacts on the environment, and also draw attention to how much culture can affect how we behave. So we did 5 different ones. We had Homer versus Lisa Simpson. We had Emily in Paris, who needs a Paris Agreement just for her wardrobe and jet-setting lifestyle, versus Frankie from Frankie and Grace, who shops vintage and is, vegetarian. So we had some fun with that. It was kind of a fun way to highlight some of those issues.
I'll have to check that out. That's pretty fun. Yeah, I know it is definitely a fun and engaging way to learn more and make it more relatable for others to understand. Okay, and just going on to the next question, more about your work as a published author. So what are the most important personal satisfactions and dissatisfactions connected with the kind of literature that you publish in environmentalism? What do you find the most satisfying of this process? What's maybe some challenges that you face?
Okay, so the main challenge is time. So trying to do this on top of my job is, I do sometimes struggle with burnout, but it's also so rewarding. There's nothing like sort of having a creative outlet. I think, one, it helps me deal with some of my climate anxiety, which I have a bit of, because I tend to focus on writing what we can do right, rather than talking about what would happen if we continue to do things wrong. So, because I don't actually like much climate fiction, I find it quite dark and depressing. And also I've done quite a bit of research that shows that you can't really scare people green. And a lot of climate fiction, one, it appeals to those who already are aware, but also it mostly talks about how terrible the future will be unless we change our ways. But I've done quite a lot of research in the field of news and in the field of education and in the field of storytelling. And they all show the same thing, that if you show solutions, you're much more likely to inspire more sustainable behaviour than if you just show the bad side, if you just show the problem. And when people get really worried or nervous and they also feel powerless, it doesn't mean they're going to give up beef and flying and start campaigning for climate policies. It can mean they start prepping, get, support for far right extremist leaders, who will blame it all on a particular group of society. You're not necessarily going to get the kind of behaviour you want. So there seemed to be nothing in the space of either mainstream fiction that someone who didn't really care about green issues would read, that sort of integrated climate solutions or green behaviours in it, like a kind of product placing of that, where the hero cycles rather than drives a sports car, or the heroine does a fashion swap rather than, go shopping bags after bags of new clothes. That trope in every rom-com. So there's not much in that space, and there's not much in a space set in the future where you look at what a sustainable society might look like if we did it right and showed how we might get there. So there's no visions of what a flourishing society might look like. So there's just dystopias. So I really wanted to write into that space. And I've done a mixture of both. Some are sort of like rom-coms or mysteries aimed at mainstream, and some are more very much focused on more systemic solutions and the kinds of policies that will get us to a flourishing future.
Okay, great. No, it was definitely nice to hear your perspective on that. And just for the next question, how do you view sustainability, especially within the climate action sector, and maybe when it comes to biodiversity conservation? Do you have any personal core values that, I guess, motivate you to live a more sustainable lifestyle?
So, I'll give you an example with Habitat Man.
One of the things that my green garden consultant did for me is he opened my eyes to my back garden. And I'd sort of thought of it as scenery. But then I realised that the magpie would only chatter when the cat appeared, and I realised that the sparrows would fly out and get upset when the neighbour got his trimmer out.
He told me that when I added flea treatment to my dogs, it affected the soil, and the soil was actually not very fertile or rich. When we started digging, a robin came because it was looking for worms, and suddenly that robin was a character now in my garden, and I knew it lived here, and I knew it would always appear if I dug anything because it was looking for worms. And it was like the garden was black and white, and it came into colour for me. I just saw it as this sort of mini soap opera right outside my door that I'd never properly seen. And a lot of it was going on underground. And I think we're more aware now of fungi and mushrooms and how everything connects, and the trees connect to each other through all the underground networks and the ecosystem. And I just became so aware that what I did would affect a whole community without me necessarily knowing it. So, when I planted a buddleia and that garden was flooded with butterflies, that was a joy, and when I didn't destroy a tree stump because he said, oh no, it will rot down, the beetle larva will get in there and that will attract hedgehogs, and you then see how it all connects. And one of the things that a lot of the readers of Habitat Man said to me is that it brought their garden alive to them, that they saw it in a whole new way. And that was just opened them up to nature, really. Poetry, I think, can do that, and art can do that.
And I realised that the bees like this plant and the butterflies like the buddleia. And I just, and that using worming treatment on my dog and flea treatment was affecting the life in my soil. And it just came alive. It was like it was in black and white, and it came into full colour. I just didn't really ever see it as having a life of its own. And that just changed everything for me. I see nature as part of this big soap opera going on around me, and I'm a small part of it. And once you do that, everything you do has an impact, and it makes it a lot easier to care, I think. Well, it does for me. Everyone finds their own way there. But it made nature and valuing nature suddenly really matter to me. So, and I just don't think we are encouraged to join the dots between our choices, our consumption choices, and the impacts on the environment. So I think I just learned to join the dots on that, just being mindful, trying to walk a little bit lighter on the earth.
Now that we have gotten to know you personally, I want to know more about your career as both a researcher and an author. So the question is, what motivates you to continue in this field and to pursue this endeavor? So how has your research in sustainable business helped to inform and inspire you as an author of environmental literature?
So I've learned a lot about how urgent the climate crisis is, and that inspires me to really want to do everything I can. I'm also very aware that in my academic world, I'm only teaching students who choose to take optional courses in, say, sustainable business. Only those who already care are reading academic papers I write. There wasn't much in the fiction world that shows people behaving sustainably as a normal activity. Quite often, if there's green people, they're portrayed as a bit niche or quirky. And also in the field of climate fiction in particular, it's very dystopian. So I wanted to fill that gap where I'm producing either myself or through the Green Stories Project, a fiction aimed at mainstream readers, which incorporates sustainable practices, climate policies, things we can do in our own backyards, but also things we can campaign for and support. So that's been my motivation. It helps keep me sane.
Okay, great. No, I like that idea of not scaring people green, especially when it comes to things like climate anxiety. What would be your favorite aspect of being, I guess, both an academic researcher, but also, I guess, getting the opportunity to focus on environmental literature? I know you do storybooks and children's fiction as well. So yeah, so what's your favorite aspect? How did you forge that genuine passion for environmentalism and writing fiction? And how's it transformed and influenced your career choice? I'm curious to know how it's happened.
I like being in the academic world because I love academics in the sense that they're informed by evidence and critical thinking. And that's so important at the moment where almost every big decision has been made on the basis of misinformation. So I think academics are still very relevant there. I like being employed, I'll be honest. Being a writer and relying on that for your sole salary is a precarious position. Very few writers make enough to keep, to pay the mortgage, even if they're reasonably successful. You have to be an absolute bestseller, I think, for it to be profitable for you. So being an academic and doing research and staying up to date and involved in that network of people who are keeping me up to date is really useful, and I really like that. But fiction is my creative outlet. It's my joy. It's where I can create the worlds I'd like to create, where I have more control. I can play around with characters and plots and make myself laugh and make myself cry, and hopefully do the same for the readers. So those two bits mesh quite well.
Okay, yeah, no, it's interesting to hear how you kind of combine being both a researcher, a scientist, and a novelist. And yeah, that's really interesting. And how has the medium of environmental fiction, has it helped to resolve and overcome any tough moments in your life? And I know a lot of people, for example, use poetry as an outlet to write about climate anxiety and stuff like that. Has it helped you kind of overcome those obstacles?
Yeah, for sure. I think a big one was my first novel, Habitat Man. And I wrote that during the pandemic. And it was a beautiful spring, and it was a good time to be writing a book that was, shared a love of nature and nature habitats. But it was also at a time when my mum was dying, and I felt very helpless because it was hard to get to see her. And it can be a lonely time, pandemic. So having the characters as my company, and there's a scene where he digs up a body, and then there's a natural burial scene. And I think probably a lot of my emotions made their way into that. And that natural burial, which I wrote, served as a template for the real one from my mum. And it was quite an emotional thing, but it was also quite positive in the sense that instead of putting toxic formaldehyde and hard wood into the ground, we did a willow coffin, planted a tree. It was very much going back to the earth and replenishing the earth rather than poisoning it, which more sort of traditional funeral is literally doing. And it was quite inspiring for readers as well. And perhaps because, it was so personal to me, maybe it gave it that extra bit of heart. But I found it very helpful.
And how do you find we can mobilize readership, especially for younger generations who want to maybe become leaders in climate change awareness?
Well, at the moment, I'm running a crowdfunder because the Green Stories project, which I run, is run 23 competitions, and some of them are for children's fiction, some for novels, some for short stories. We've had quite a few publications emerge from that. But as it's got more popular, quite a lot of the people wanting to sponsor it are kind of almost using it to reputation wash what they're doing. So we've had to turn down some sponsorship because it didn't align with our sustainable values. So I thought I'd got people's hopes up that it'd be a competition, and then I had to cancel because I didn't want to accept the money. So we're crowdfunding and we're tying it. So my new book is just launching, Murder in the Climate Assembly. It's it's a mixture of whodunit and literary fiction. And it's also partly set in a university. So it's just for anyone who likes reading novels. And that's inspired by a local citizens' assembly on climate we had where I live. And I met some of the people who participated in it. And the idea is they're given an issue and, they have lots of information provided to them by experts, and they have to decide where to prioritise policy and spending. So it's a lovely way of engaging people in decision making. And there's been quite a lot of call for citizens' assemblies to have more power. Because I think, 2024 was the year of elections, wasn't it? And I think, again, misinformation really was the name of the day. When it came to a lot of the information coming around, people were listening to was just plain wrong. And so I think there are problems with our democracy. And rather than go over to authoritarianism, I thought it would be much nicer to go more participative. And in Europe, especially, citizens' assemblies are becoming quite a big thing, where you get maybe about 100 people together, they debate a particular issue, and then they come up with a proposal. Because the people involved in it are more representative. They're not all just like massively rich, powerful people. They come from all sections of society, and they're listening to evidence, not business interests or lobbyists, So I thought setting a story in a citizens' assembly would be a nice way to raise awareness of this and a good opportunity to showcase climate policies. And of course, when someone dies, when there's a murder, that's fun. That's entertaining. So we're launching the new book, and any money over needed to produce that is going towards a Green Stories competition. And then we're hoping we can use that to fund a new competition. And if we get some nice stuff there, then we can publish it via Habitat Press, which is the imprint we set up to support that. So it's about sort of creating a community of writers who are engaged in, changing the world for the better through great stories that, people want to read.
Okay, great. And just to backtrack a bit, I wanted to ask your personal definition of sustainability and sustainable development. Is there a particular SDG you best advocate for, I guess, both from your perspective as a researcher and a novelist? Do you think these metrics still hold merit?
Controversially, I'm not a big fan of the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of them. And I think, if you've got the tick box mentality, and having worked with businesses quite often, to be honest, with the university too, sustainability is a box to be ticked rather than necessarily something to actually a transformation in the way you do things. And I think it encourages that, because almost anything you could fit into one or other box. Economic growth is one of the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'm afraid I don't accept the argument that economic growth is possible while living sustainably, because every time people talk about green growth, when you actually look at when we've changed something to be more efficient or use less energy, we've just used way more of it. We haven't actually resulted in less resources being used. So I think we need to move away from economic growth as the main goal of policy and as the main metric of success, because it doesn't always align very well with living in a sort of world with social justice flourishing and sustainable in terms of what the environment can actually support and, carbon emissions. So I'm not a big fan of those metrics, I'm afraid.
Yeah, okay. No, it's interesting to hear your perspective again as a researcher, because I remember when I was in grad school in Sweden, they were very much bashing on the SDGs, whereas I don't know if the Canadian education system or in North America it's different, whereas during my bachelor's, we very much adhered to it. So, and in a sense, what you're saying makes sense because, the term sustainable development itself is a paradox if you think about it. And the whole idea of green growth, and it kind of buys into the whole idea of the Anthropocene. We're not really taking that, I guess, biocentric or eco-inclusive perspective of all flora and fauna. And of course, there's things like degrowth, which is also another interesting concept. But yeah, I agree. Don't take them too literally, but use them more as like guideposts almost.
I just think we need to walk more lightly upon the earth. And I think we can do that really easily. I think we can cut our carbon emissions by 100% with almost no change in well-being. I mean, if we just look at every aspect, if you look at photos, do you need to take 200 photos a day when you're on holiday? Is your well-being really affected if you just take 2? Or if you delete the ones you don't want? Because the cloud isn't some puffy white thing in the sky. It's huge factories burning out emissions. Do we need to wash our hair twice, rinse, repeat, do that every day with hot water? That's actually really bad for the hair and skin. So things like less is more when it comes to a lot of the products we use. Same with laundry, washing on a lower temperature would massively cut our carbon emissions. Eating less meat, better for your health too. All of these things are actually better for us anyway. But everything in our environment encourages us to consume as much as possible to feed the GDP, the gross domestic product, the economic growth. But none of that affects our, it's good for our well-being. Actually, it can be worse. So we just need a different mindset, a different metric of success, I think. I mean, I don't talk just from being around for a while and talking to people at, COP28 and COP27 and seeing how business actually behaves. I'm quite firm of this opinion now that we're on the wrong road. If we try and just go around ticking SDG boxes and pursuing economic growth. It's very short term.
Yeah, no, it's very insightful to hear your perspective on that. Thanks for sharing that. And just moving on to the next question, do you want to explain more about Thrutopia in regard to the climate crisis? Because I came across this term and I was curious how the concept helps to combat climate anxiety, and I haven't heard too much of that here on our end. Maybe it's something that more so immersed in the UK. Do you want to talk about that? And is it part of your writing as well?
Yeah, certainly. So, we know utopia literally means no land or no place. And it's this perfect world. And when we think of it, we immediately think of everything that could be terrible about a perfect world, like you oppress everybody who's not behaving well. So we can't even hold this image of a perfect world in our head without kind of wanting to ruin it. But we think of dystopia, and I think most climate fiction is dystopian. It portrays this terrible world that will result because we haven't taken action in time. Thrutopia, my take on it is you imagine the world you'd want to live in. Imagine that we've made all the right decisions and what a truly sustainable world might look like. And then you create that vision in your head, and then you kind of work back from there to see how you might get there. So for me, I would think, well, in order to get there, you probably need a different decision-making process, because our current everything in terms of decisions is geared to short-term decision-making. tied to electoral cycles, fed with information by those with the deepest pockets, who aren't the nicest necessarily. So for me, looking at the decision making where the power is was important. Hence, I decided to focus on citizens' assemblies to raise awareness of them. You'd need a lower growth, a way of accessing everything you need without using more resources. So things like the sharing economy, the libraries of things, repair and reuse, subscription models to fashion, games, tools, rather than buy, use, throw away. You need to build incentives for people to do that, because all these things are already available. Public transport is already available, but we don't really use it. So if you had something like a personal carbon allowance, where everyone had their own carbon allowance, then there'd be incentives to adopt low carbon practices, such as, travelling by public transport or eating less beef or switching to a renewable energy provider. At the moment, there aren't really strong incentives, but you won't make those decisions with the current government. Hence, you need to look at power. So all of these ideas are in my latest novel. And I set out these sort of building blocks, the ones that politicians really are afraid to talk about. And by setting it in a citizens' assembly, every character in there has a different relationship to it. Some will like the idea, some won't. It will benefit some people, not so much others. So it's a lovely way of looking at how a policy will affect people's lives in an entertaining way, because one of them's going to be murdered and one of them's going to be the murderer. So it's kind of fun. But that's my idea of the Throughtopian approach. What are the building blocks, the steps, A, B, C, D, to get us to where we want to go? It's almost like project management on a sort of massive scale. We take a systems approach to how the levers of business and government and consumers and culture and how that all interacts, and look at where the levers are, what buttons can you push, so that suddenly we all want to do it this way rather than that way. And I think because of my background, like my first degree was politics and economics. I did a psychology PhD. I'm now in the business school. I've worked in social enterprises and businesses. So I've got quite a broad perspective, which has been bad for me as an academic, because you're supposed to really focus. But it has been good to seeing how all the bits join together, which I think sometimes can be hard for a lot of people to gather. I can see the jigsaw in a broader framework. And I've tried to bring that perspective to my writing. The challenge then is to make it entertaining and fun and people want to turn the page. So that's a whole other thing. That's the craft of fiction writing.
Interesting. No, it's definitely interesting to hear your take on that. And for the next question, so I, just to give a bit of background, so I was a former journalist and reporter. I'm in digital marketing, of course, and I worked in mainstream corporate media. And I just didn't like the way, because when you would pitch, I don't know how it is where you're living in the UK, but I live in a pretty conservative province. So it's a huge oil and gas industry, and they're not big on, writing about pitching those news stories that are about the environment, and maybe we'll write about the wildfires, which we tend to have a lot during the summer. So it kind of made me realize, why do we have this almost like this old and destructive narrative of the way we're portraying climate change? And it just wasn't like what you're mentioning. There's a lot of disinformation going on. So I guess the question is, how does your perspective on challenging someone to adopt more sustainable behaviors inform your perspective as a researcher, especially when we look at the dominant, narrative in the media? There's a lot of fear mongering going around the climate crisis. And I know you kind of are doing this through your novels. Do you want to speak more to this?
Yeah, I think just lecturing people or telling them how bad things will be doesn't necessarily work. So what I try and do, and this is a classic rule of fiction, is show, don't tell. So if you show someone engaging with sustainable practices in a positive way, you're inspiring them through their heart, not their head. And I'm just really glad that my writing managed to do that. But I was just passing on, in a way, how I'd been made to feel and how my eyes had opened. So I think showing someone through their heart, in a way, is much better than, I could have given a lecture on wildlife gardening and it wouldn't have had the same effect. It's like music can do it. Touch your heart in a way that the words sometimes can't.
Yeah, no, it's definitely interesting how, you're writing and the medium that you're using, you're adopting that system thinking perspective and that biocentrism, and you're talking about all these like creatures. And it actually, funnily enough, it reminds me, because you've obviously heard of, when you look at very popular literature, things like the Chronicles of Narnia, when you read it as a kid, you don't really understand it. Like, you don't understand, like, they're talking about the Anthropocene, they're talking about biocentrism, similar to what you're doing. And when you read it now as an adult, you're like, if you've studied sustainability, it's very eye-opening. And I'm like, oh, well, it's almost, the creatures can talk and all this, and it makes you feel very empathetic to what's going on. And I didn't realize that as a kid, but now reading it now as an adult, I'm like, oh, okay, I can see these, like, I can see these themes. Yeah. But like, for this next question, how can we utilize the persuasion of storytelling as an effective pursuit for changing, I guess, the status quo towards climate action advocacy? So I mentioned the Chronicles of Narnia, but I'm sure you've heard of the American classics, things like, Dr. Seuss and the Lorax, which is, also an animated film now. So just to recap for anyone listening out there, so it's basically about, again, the dangers of unchecked industrialization and consumerism and the importance of protecting the natural world. So the protagonist is basically euphemism for environmental activism and combating the disastrous consequences of industrialization and deforestation. So again, we see this reoccurring narrative through other popular culture media of storytelling, through films, television, and video games, which examines, I guess, the post-apocalyptic outcome side of things. And we don't really want to, again, go in that direction, as I mentioned, that results in a lot of fear-mongering and the fear of the unknown. So I like the way you're going, because you take almost like this benevolent and positive perspective on the matter through the way you're writing. So I guess, yeah, how can we make it more persuasive, storytelling more persuasive?
Yeah, there's no one size fits all. So I've kind of been quite critical of the very negative aspect, but some people are scared green. So, that does work for some people. I don't go down that path for two reasons. One is that it also can have unintended consequences, which you might not want. I don't really like writing that way. And also the public is well served. There's plenty out there that's dystopian. So that's something that I go there. But I'm not saying it doesn't work for everyone. So some people are scared green. One way you can do it is to help people join the dots. So you can actually, like in the book Habitat Man, that there are connections made. People don't realise that a hardwood coffin means that, it's linked to deforestation, which you might not realise. And you might not realise that the embalming fluids used in a typical one are actually poisoning everything in the earth. Most people just don't know. So you can put in little snippets of knowledge. If you do too much, it will tip it over and it will read more like non-fiction, and your writing will be clunky. But I think now and then you can drop the odd snippet in where it would naturally arise. So there's the awareness raising, but awareness and attitudes don't necessarily link that well to actual behaviour. What we do tend to do is behave the way we think everyone else is behaving. So just showing people cycling to their date or to their work, or, down to the pub rather than driving or getting the bus, just showing people if they want to get new clothes, maybe going to the thrift shops or charity shops or doing a fashion swap with their mates, rather than the usual trope of going shopping and coming back with 20 bags, plastic bags full of new stuff. That's fast fashion, which is a huge burden on the environment. Just showing people eating low carbon foods or vegetarian foods. All these things are just normalizing this as the kind of things that your heroes and heroines, your protagonists, are doing. So I think quite often, you don't have to give it a big this person is green. You can just sort of normalize it. And you can also show things like one of my characters has a drive share app. So there are drive share apps everywhere. I mean, different companies are prevalent in different areas, but quite often you can rent your car out when you're not using it. You can make a fortune, actually. Or if you don't want a car all the time, there might be someone up your road who's using it and you can share it. So you can just have a character who has that. And it's a good way of promoting these things that might be available. So there's that way, just normalizing it. Another one is showing how change happens. So someone could be, just making a difference, and showing them making a difference can inspire you to do the same. So increasing that sense of agency. Some, like Habitat Man, is a lot just dripped in very subtly about what you can do in your own homes and gardens. Whereas Murder in the Climate Assembly is more policies that people can do and what you can campaign for and ask for. But that's built into the plot, so it's not like added on. So there's so many different ways that you can do it. Subtly, you can do it through humour. You can just have it in the background, or some things of your novel set in the future. You can showcase a positive vision. Like one of the winners of the Green Stories Prize, their book was set in the future, and this guy wakes up and he's been cryogenically frozen, but he doesn't know why. And he goes out and it's quite a nice society. I mean, not everything's nice, but a lot of stuff is working very well. And so you can see what has been done to make it work so well in the background. And he's learning about it. So there's the plot makes him want to learn, what's happening now? So you can showcase these things. But the hook is, why on earth was he frozen? And what's he going to do about his wife, who's now in a care home while he's like only about 30? So, it's quite a nice opportunity through that plot device to showcase a positive vision in the context of an entertaining plot.
That's definitely interesting to hear your take on that. And I'm glad there's other ways of portraying climate action incentives and to motivate others through these mediums. Okay, great. And on this next question, from your perspective, what are the major problems that you see working in the field, both as a scientist, researcher, and a novelist? Is there any particular social problem you've identified within environmentalism that is a particular pain point, and how are you responding to it?
I think if you're in this field, it's easy to suffer from climate anxiety. And I think sometimes that can lead you to perhaps communicate with people in a way that isn't effective. So if I've just heard the latest statistics and I'm terrified and I'm going to work and, they'll say something like, you will get rewarded for getting in a 4-star journal. And it's like, well, none of them are sustainability journals. What if we got rewarded for doing stuff that aligns, with a flourishing planet? And sometimes, there's times and places to say these things, and there's a way of saying it. And if you get too climate anxious, sometimes you can alienate people. People don't want to be scared. And so I just think keeping your cool and keeping a way to keep yourself positive and focusing on what you can do rather than how you feel, how disappointed you feel about the way things are going and what isn't being done. I think it's really important to keep your mental health sound.
Okay, great. No, that's very sage advice. I think everyone should definitely follow that and just keep things in perspective. And just on this last question, so for any of our listeners out there, if they happen to get their hands on a copy of Habitat Man and they're also inspired to become a writer or an author and write more about climate action, are there any particular skills that you would recommend that are most important for being a writer and author in this field?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's so many how to be a good writer podcasts and books and so on. Definitely follow them up, because one of the things is when you're trying to write to change the world for the better, it's too easy to become clunky and info dumping and preachy. And if you want to write a non-fiction book, write a non-fiction book. If you want to write a novel, first and foremost, people have to be entertained. So if you go in too hard, you'll lose your audience. So I just think whatever you're writing, make the most of all the resources to hand. I mean, I've really enjoyed listening to, certain podcasts on writing technique, and every now and then I'll go to a sort of local course on writing, and there's always be something there I mean, there's less and less I learn each time because I've become more experienced, a creative fiction writer, but it's still nice to engage with other writers. So I think that would be my main advice. On our Green Stories webpage, that's greenstories.org.uk, there's loads of resources there for writers. You know, we hope to have a new competition soon. We've got tips on writing for sustainability. We've got some of our publications that we've got that are really good examples of how you can write engaging fiction with a solution focus. So I definitely recommend checking that out. So there's quite a lot of resources there for writers.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll definitely be sure to mention that because it seems like, as you mentioned, there's a diverse palette, and to everyone, they might have a preference of some sort of content to others. So, and like you said, there's a lot of relatable content. Some might be just into reading like a murder mystery novel, but some might be more into poetry, maybe comic books and sustainable superheroes. So there's definitely a lot to choose from. So it's great. No, it's great advice. Okay, well, that's all the questions on my end. And in short, just to wrap up for today, do you want to share your future vision, I guess, as an author on environmentalism? Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share that maybe I missed or we haven't talked about?
I think, I just want to make people aware of the Green Stories project. I think if you Google it, it should come up. And Habitat Press is our imprint where we publish all our books. And like I say, we've got a Kickstarter coming up now, so that'll be running throughout February. Be really keen, if you're part of the passionate group of people who think we need to reach a wider audience with climate solutions, and fiction is a good way to do it, then please do support that and help us make that a reality. And I think that's about it, really. Wish you luck. And I do talks, and I've done a few keynotes and things like that on. So if anyone wants me to come and talk, do get in touch. I'm easy to find if you Google Denise Baden. I'm not too difficult to find.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Denise. Thanks so much for tuning in to yet another eye-opening episode of Sustainable You. Again, this is an extraordinary and engaging info series whose purpose is to make sustainable development and sustainability accessible to the average person in their quest to quench their knowledge on environmentalism. Be sure to leave your feedback by liking this week's released edition and by subscribing to this podcast. Again, any love from our followers is much appreciated. Signing off until next time.